Hello and welcome to History Hack. It's our first weekend edition and we're ever so slightly excited. Well, I'm not quite as excited as Alina is. I am, but I'm not hysterical. Alina, can you do this without screaming?
I'm going to try and be as professional as I possibly can in this very moment.
Tell everyone who's here. Do it.
I'm absolutely honoured to introduce to you all the renowned scholar and classical historian, Professor Mary Beard. She has published many best-selling historical books, like her book on Pompeii, SPQR, Laughter in Ancient Rome, while I get things wrong, including many, many others. Some of you will also recognise her from her amazing TV programmes. Thank you, Mary, for joining us, and welcome.
Oh, it's great to be here. You're doing a really grand job in these troubled times.
Oh, thank you.
I am honoured.
So, Mary, how are you faring with lockdown? You're in Cambridge, aren't you?
I'm in Cambridge, and I'm working at home, and I'm being very obedient, and I'm not going out. But I have to confess that I'm not following all the bits of advice you normally see about how you should work from home, like always get dressed. I sometimes find that I am in my dressing gown all day, and I'm my naturally indisciplined tendencies are becoming more pronounced.
I think you're fine because we've already admitted to showering less, both of us, at some point this week. I think it is a little bit of an excuse to let yourself go, and I'm not sorry. I'm not going to use expensive MAC makeup when the only person who's going to see it is my cat. So I'm going to embrace it. I don't smell like a badger or anything, but I am perhaps not as diligent as I have been, and I suspect, Mary, you've admitted as well that you got pajamas most of the week.
That's right, and I am letting myself go a little bit, but maybe there's nothing too wrong about that,
No, I
don't like this New Zealand idea where you get up and they've got in New Zealand the kind of self-quarantining. People are getting dressed every Friday in their posh clothes to kind of show that they're still social human beings. But it seems to me absolutely ghastly.
Oh, that's awful. We recorded our first Down the Pub segment last night, and everybody was lying around on their sofas getting drunk, and we all looked awful, and we loved it. It was just as much fun and no effort whatsoever. So yeah, I'm with you, Mary. I'm not doing that.
Let Mary, it all out. That's what I said.
So, Mary, I've actually attended quite a fair few of your talks.
Great. Gosh.
She is a closet classical historian. She's a Holocaust historian or a concentration camp historian. But whenever you mention classical history, or you in particular, or Pompeii in particular, she starts squealing like a 12-year-old.
It's never too late, Alina. It's never too late to change your specialism.
You sound exactly like Catherine Edwards and Christie and all of my ancient historical classical lecturers at uni. They were like, you should change, come to the dark side. But I actually have a question before we get involved into our Q&A. So I went to a talk of yours for your book Roman Laughter. Absolutely love the talk, by the way. But you actually answered a really question that I'm really hoping you can tell our listeners, and it was, how did you actually come up with the idea for the book?
That's quite a funny story, I suppose, that I'd agreed to do the series of lectures that kind of underpins the book about laughter. And it's always much easier to agree to give a series of lectures than to decide what the hell you're going to give them on. And they were getting more and more pressing that I should provide a title for the lectures. And eventually, really it was, I was up against it. And I happened to be in California, and I happened to be by a swimming pool, drinking a very nice gin and tonic. And I thought, look, I've got, there's 10 minutes now, and I've just got to send them an email back to say, so aided by the sun, the pool, and the G&T, I thought, do you know what? I want to write about something that is kind of fun. The last book I'd written had been about the Roman triumph, and I think it's very interesting, but it was very kind of serious power politics and military. I thought, I know what I'll do. Well, I'll write about laughter. So I just sent that off. I just said to them, oh, okay, I'm going to do Roman laughter. And at that stage, it became, I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't sort of write back in 12 months' time and say, well, I'm not sure I'm going to do that anymore. So it was a topic conceived with alcohol-assisted by a swimming pool.
I think this is brilliant because it just confirms or reaffirms for me anyway the godlike presence of gin and tonic and how it is never ever a bad thing. Alina's a vodka girl. You have to excuse her today because she did drink nearly an entire bottle for our Down the Pub segment, which is, I think it's a bit of nerves, but I think she might be hanging just a little bit. Alina, are you ready?
I am. I'm really ready, actually. We've got some amazing, absolutely amazing questions that I'm really excited, including one from my mum, who also got very excited. So should we kick off the Q&A?
Yeah, let's.
Okay, so I thought I would put this one in for the first question because it's from a lovely lady who wants to ask a question for her 14-year-old son. So the question is from Sarah Laws, and she asks, how did the Romans do multiplication and long division, as you can't do it with Roman numerals, as she can't do long division with Arabic numerals?
Right, well that I think is one of the really interesting questions about Roman life. I mean, I think some of the most interesting are questions about ancient Rome, are the questions that we kind of don't bother to ask ourselves. And you look at these Roman numerals and then you suddenly twig, how on earth did they do calculations? I mean, it's not just multiplication, it's, basically how do you do adding up? No, I'm not a historian of maths. And if you Google this, you can find some extremely complicated ways in which you can do multiplication in those very strange Roman numerals. And maybe that was a system that some Romans used. But I think that what we have to kind of get on board with here is that almost certainly most basic day-to-day calculations, I've got, so many of these and I want to sell them at however many denarii each, how much profit will I make? Those kind of calculations. I'm sure that most were done on abacuses and that they didn't, most ordinary people, in the local bakers, in the local shop, didn't use that kind of Roman numeral notation that we're so familiar with still. It's on, half our clocks in the West have still got Roman numerals on. I bet they used abacuses. Now, at this point, you're going to say, well, how do you do it with an abacus? And then I'm going to say, I don't know. But what is absolutely clear to me from looking at cultures today where abacuses are still used is that you can do enormously complicated calculations using an abacus, if you've been trained to do so. I haven't been. So I think the answer is most people didn't try to do long multiplication with Roman numerals.
That's brilliant. Can I just say, though, that a historian of maths sounds like the worst job in the world ever. I think I'd rather work on a self-checkout somewhere than do that. I'm going to move on to, please excuse my pronunciation, I'm going to try and get it right. Rossana Nachera is asking again for a student. Could we ask for a child thinking of taking A-level ancient history? Yes, come on, let's make them choose it. What would she recommend as a good taster/introductory book to introduce them to the subject?
Well, I think actually there's lots that are really good. And so these are very kind of personal choices, and please, anybody listening this who doesn't find their own book mentioned, this is not a criticism, but there's too many out there. And I think for Greek history, I think somebody whose books really do kind of speak to the moment is a writer called Paul Cartledge, and he wrote a book a long time ago now, but it's still very good, called The Greeks. And he's recently written a book about democracy, which goes beyond ancient Greece, but actually is very much thinking about how modern ideas of democracy are both in tension with and dependent on ancient Greek ideas of democracy. So I would go with Paul Cartledge. For Rome, if you want a good narrative of one of the key periods, I think that Tom Holland's Rubicon, which tells the story of ultimately the fall of the Roman Republic down to Julius Caesar, is a great read. Modesty should forbid me to say this, but I think that my book on Pompeii is quite fun if you want to find out how archaeology can contribute to understanding literally what happened in an ordinary bog standard Roman town like Pompeii. It's called Pompeii, A Life in a Roman Town. So
modesty be damned, Mary. Your SPQR is the best book on ancient Rome I've ever read. And that should be on the list as well.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. Yes.
I totally agree with the Paul Cartledge book as well. I mean, Paul is brilliant. He's a brilliant Greek historian, ancient Greek historian. Sorry.
I think Mary was spreading the love a bit there as well, but Tom Holland's Persian Fire, I love that. I prefer that to Rubicon personally.
Oh,
but again, yeah, I do. I did, because I had to use that for my A-level study. So I fell in love with it then, and that's what made me read Rubicon afterwards. But I didn't quite fall in love with it the same. But Alina, move on. So let's move away from the A-level students and try and, we're not going to try and stump Mary, but let's try and give her something a bit more meaty to get into.
Perfect, no worries. So we've got Kevin McInerney. I apologise again for the pronunciation. I had to gen up on Greek history, something to help my daughter. Athens had everything: theatre, science, philosophy, democracy, as tremendous military successes against threats from the east. And yet, why couldn't Athens and Sparta have just tried to get along?
Gosh, that would have been nice, wouldn't it? I mean, I think that raises a really big question about conflict between states in the ancient world. And it reminds me of what one of my own undergraduate teachers said to me ages ago. Moses Finley, a really great ancient historian, and perhaps I ought to have recommended some of his books because they're still damn good. He said, what you have to understand about the ancient world is that it's not a world in which war breaks out. And the kind of the normal state of affairs is peace. It's a world in which peace breaks out and the normal state of affairs is war. And what I think he was trying to get at was that what you have is, in a sense, the idea that every city-state, particularly in the Greek world, and we're dealing with Athens and Sparta, essentially their relationship to one another is always one of conflict. So what you're seeing is a world which kind of configures the whole relationship between states and thinks of what the normal state of affairs is in a completely different way from us. It's a kind of, it's constantly competitive, and it's more than competitive, it's also conflictual. And in many ways, that's one of the kind of biggest differences, which I think Finley was trying to capture by saying, look, think of this as a world in which peace breaks out, not war. That we're dealing with constant, low-level hostility, not with nice international cooperation.
Look
what happens.
Sorry, I was just going to say, that nails it for me, that quote about this is a world where peace breaks out and not war.
Yeah.
I'm gonna roll. That's Mary's got an email. I'm just gonna roll in the next 3 questions. Kind of everybody is talking about. We had a lot of questions about talking about the ancient world and pandemics and plagues, and they want to know various things. So, just there are 3 key points, I think. We have one question that says, it's a statement. This crisis is unique in human history up until the climate crisis, true or false? There's another one asking if ancient Greeks and Romans left any narratives or advice about how we could deal with this. And finally, Julia would like to know who did best. She also says, Mary, please keep cheerful, wash your hands and look after your neighbours.
I think that's really interesting, because the ancient world is a world in which plague, pestilence, contagion is always on the agenda. And there were some really devastating outbreaks of it. I mean, one of the classic instances comes in the middle of the 5th century BC, in the middle of the Great War between, or the very beginning of the Great War between Athens and Sparta, where Athens is devastated by a plague. And many people would suggest, and I think it's not stupid, that the loss of manpower that Athens suffered at the beginning of her great war with Sparta was one of the reasons that she lost the war, that she just lost too many soldiers. Now, that in some ways is at a smaller scale globally from what we're looking at now. But, in a sense, in terms of the universe of Athens, it was as devastating. And people write, it's a particularly vivid account in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War in Book 2, where he talks about, the number of corpses that there were, people dying on top of other people, the panic, the real kind of sense of social and moral breakdown that happened. And you might say, okay, well, that's small. It probably did affect places other than Athens, but Athens was very cooped up, in, sort of under lockdown almost, against the Spartans. And of course, then the plague spread particularly quickly amongst them. But if you go to Rome and you go to the 2nd century AD, there's a plague in the second half of the 2nd century, which is a much more recognizably global outbreak, because the Roman Empire is a joined up empire and people move around it, and so plagues spread very quickly. And that's very much akin to our globalization now, and why this is a global pandemic. It's because we've become a global culture. Now, Rome in its own terms was what they thought of as a global culture, and the whole of the empire suffered from this. Probably, we don't know, that probably millions died. Now, how did they deal with it? Well, their views of how things spread were very different from ours, and their view of the causes of epidemic was very different from ours. And it seems pretty clear that many people, not all I think, but many people saw plague as somehow God-given, that that they had not properly worshipped the gods. They had sinned, but humanity had sinned, and this was a punishment sent by the divine. I think that there are upsides to it as well, though. I mean, it's hard ever to think of an upside to a pandemic, but I think we shouldn't forget that if we think about the history of Western literature, and let's go back to the very beginning of Western literature with Homer's Iliad, what happens at the very start? What's the first episode in the Iliad? It's a plague affecting the Greek army at Troy. And so I like to say to people, look, there is a way in which awful, terrible as this kind of contagion is, actually Western literature was launched by a plague. So there are creative engagements with plague, which I think have been hugely influential. Look at Sophocles' play on Oedipus the King. What do you get? What kicks off the whole narrative of Oedipus marrying his mother and the rest? A plague. So plague is a creative tool in antiquity, as well as a terrible, devastating one.
So in terms of who did best at dealing with them, then it's not really the same thing, is it? It's not, if it's God-given, it's something that washes over you, and it's not something you tackle by the sounds of it.
No, I think nobody did best, and I think that we should count ourselves lucky, terrible as it is, that we have a much clearer idea of what causes contagion and how you can avoid it. So this is, we're feeling very gloomy, and rightly feeling very gloomy, but we've got, they didn't have ventilators in ancient Athens.
I'm actually going to combine two questions because I think they link in quite nicely. So one is from Gustavo, and then my mum actually asked the question. She got very excited that I was going to be speaking with you. So there was a fight actually there was an argument between my mum and my dad, because my dad also loves ancient history. So I said, look, one of you can ask Mary a question and one of you can ask Tom a question. So my mum won with you, Mary.
Right.
So let's start. Look, let's roll this question. I'm going to roll them into one. Sorry. It's a pleasure to ask you, what were the benefits of being a Roman soldier? Was the salary good, and could everyone enroll? And then to link onto that, my mum asked, what percentage of the invading Roman army were not ethnically Roman?
Yeah. On the advantages of being a soldier, I mean, let me just say to start with, there was a hell of a lot of disadvantages too, like wounding, death, discomfort, and so forth. But one of the things that service in the Roman army offered you was a pension. And if you were not a citizen, it offered you a way into becoming a full Roman citizen. There were basically two types of Roman soldiers. There were the legions and the so-called auxiliary troops. And the legions, in order to become a legionary, you had to already be a Roman citizen. You served changing amounts of time. They fixed the maximum length of service at different points, but certainly some years it was 16 years, it went up to 20 in some cases. But after that, once you had been discharged from the legions, you got either literally a plot of land to call your own, or you got cash, which would buy you that. So there was a sort of sense of a pension entitlement. Now, we take pension entitlements for granted, but in a world like Rome, where there is no social safety net, that was really important. In the auxiliary forces, most soldiers in the auxiliary forces were not citizens. They were members of the provincial population, and the advantage they got, as well as a bounty and discharge, was they became Roman citizens at discharge. So those soldiers became, by virtue of their service in the Roman army, it was a route into becoming a full citizen, and many of them did. And we have wonderful examples of little bronze plaques which listed the soldiers who were retiring, who'd become Roman citizens, and they presumably carried these around with them to prove their citizen status.
That's Russell Crowe, isn't it, in Gladiator? He was a Spaniard.
Yeah. It is, the thing about Rome is there's something awful about it. I don't ever want to go back there. It's not kind of, it's not my idea of where I find home, but it has all kinds of mechanisms of social mobility, particularly into citizenship. And probably the reason that the empire lasted so long is because it in a sense exploited those mechanisms to bring people on side to it, because they didn't have the manpower to enforce obedience. It was more carrot than stick often. Now, there was also plenty of stick. I don't think Boudica thought that she was being offered a carrot in any way. But you can see that there's an attempt, conscious or not, to get people to think of themselves as Roman. I mean, there is one thing that's pretty clear about the average length of service is that the Romans adjusted it much in the same way that we're now adjusting people's pensionable age. And the tendency is for the average length of service for a soldier for a legionary soldier is to move up from 16 years, get longer. Now, why do they do that? Almost certainly because this great pension plan that they offer retiring soldiers was hugely expensive for the state. And one of the ways of saving money on pensions is to make people retire later. And so you can see that by making soldiers serve longer, the state is saving money on the pension plan, largely because some of them are going to die before they reach pensionable age. That is exactly what Western governments are doing now. You know? Why is the pensionable age going up? Because we can't afford the pension. Now, as to Alina's mum's question about what's the kind of ethnicity of the Roman army that would invade, let's say, Britain, I think it's always very hard to know about ethnicity in the ancient world. We don't really know, or only get very, very fleeting glimpses of any kind of ethnic identifiers in the modern sense of the word ethnicity. But what we do know, to put it a bit more generally, is that it was a very diverse army. And most of them probably didn't come from central Italy. You know, we kind of imagine, particularly I think when we think of Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain, we imagine these poor Mediterranean types, you know, who are used to lovely Italian sunshine, you know, ending up you know, in the pouring rain and cold at South Shields. Well, actually, the Roman army by certainly into the 1st century AD and the 2nd century AD was very mixed. An awful lot of the people who policed as soldiers Roman Britain actually came from what we now call Holland and Germany. They were other northern imperial types being used as the kind of guard on another northern imperial province. We also have quite a lot of evidence, though we don't know how many this was, of people from North Africa serving in both in the administration and the army of Roman Britain. And one of the most famous governors of Roman Britain is a man called Quintus Lollius Urbicus. And he comes from what we would now call Algeria. And we have evidence of this guy on Hadrian's Wall. We've got inscriptions where, you know, his governorship is commemorated. We've also got his tomb just outside the town of Tidis in Algeria. Now, we have no idea of what we would call the ethnicity of Quintus Lollius Urbicus, but we can see that it is a much more mixed army than the sort of Asterix version of the Roman army would suggest.
So moving on to another question, Eloise would like to know, I love this question, she asks, what are the ancient Greek and Romans like as parents, and is there a concept of childhood?
That's really interesting. Partly, I think you have to say childhood was kind of invented in the late 18th, early 19th century in the West. And before that, whether it's in Rome or, you know, Britain in the 12th century, children are just small grown-ups. And our whole idea of the construction of childhood, you know, with children's own books, children's clothes, children being treated so very differently, is partly a modern construction. And so the Romans didn't have it. Now, I think that that's true. I think you can go a bit too far down that line. And there is some sense that kids had toys, surprise, surprise. And archaeological excavation in tombs has found little kind of wheelie things with which you pull on a string. And there is a sense that children were a bit treated differently. So a famous passage of the Roman historian Tacitus takes us to what the dining arrangements were like in the 1st century AD Roman palace. Now, actually, the children dined together with the grown-ups in the royal family, but they dine on a separate table. There's a kind of kids table and a grown-up table. So you don't have the kind of cult of childhood, and you certainly don't have any notion of the teenager or anything like that. And you have some concessions to the idea that young people, insofar as they are young, have certain different privileges or restrictions. And the earliest Roman law code, for example, discusses, and this is back in the 5th century BC, seems to discuss what the age of criminal responsibility is. That if a child nicks an apple, the child doesn't get treated in the same way that a grown-up would get treated if it stops something. But much more limited.
I think, because part of my research now, I'm doing Edward VIII, and I'm talking about the introduction in the 1930s of the concept of youth and of there being like something in between childhood and adulthood. I think it's a very modern thing.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And we kind of think of, we've so internalized, the whole kind of, partly for commercial reasons, childhood is a big seller and people make a lot of money out of childhood. We've internalized this category, which the Romans and kind of anybody before the 19th century certainly wouldn't have. And I think you're right, the teenager is an invention of the 20th, probably.
Alina, who's next?
So Emma asks, should women view Aristotle as a Nazi, as he claimed the female was born a substandard male and therefore born subhuman, who deserved to be eliminated for her failure in not being born a perfect male?
I think it would be unfair on Aristotle to judge him a Nazi. I think very few women today, however, would find Aristotle's views about what a woman is particularly congenial. And if you want a book about this, Edith Hall's recent book on Aristotle, I think would be very helpful. I think that while part of me, hates Aristotle, the other part of me says, look, what he's trying to do is that something very intellectually interesting, because he's raising an issue which we still raise, and find controversial. He's trying to say, what's the difference between a woman and a man? What makes a woman? How do we understand the difference? Now, we don't find his answer particularly palatable, that a woman is a substandard man. But I think you have to give him a lot of credit, and other ancient writers too, for the first time in the West, really facing that difference about how do we understand sex and gender? And we know that we've still not got that sorted out. And so I think we can be a little tolerant of Aristotle in making a bit of a mess of his answer and congratulating him on raising the question.
I think, because had he been serious about eliminating all women, there's a flaw there, isn't there, for the future of humanity? So I think you're right. Yeah. Okay, so going on to our next question, we have Potato Toro, which is a bit of a tongue twister, would like to know, what was life like for the working class? Did they live the typical Roman house, for instance, or in a smaller terrace-style house? And what was their day-to-day life like?
I think that we've sort of been brought up, partly from film and television, to kind of have this image of a typical Roman house. It's got a nice little garden in the centre, and it has a front hall, and even if it's small, it's reasonably posh. Now, I think that for the ordinary person, you have to forget that. I mean, even that level of housing is for the relatively privileged. And if we're talking about Rome and Italy itself, I'm not talking about Britain here. Most people in Britain would have lived like they'd lived in, in the Iron Age, they'd have lived in, perfectly nice but modest huts, probably. But if you're thinking about Italy, and particularly about the city of Rome, then most people are probably living in high-rise apartments. Some of those apartments reasonably decent, reasonably spacious, but others effectively kind of tenement multiple occupancy. And I suppose if you're going to be brutal, what you'd say is people who had even one room to call their own were still doing relatively okay. And there is a frightening lot of stuff in Roman law codes, for example, about what to do about the people who were in kind of squatter accommodation under aqueducts, or using somebody's tomb to live in. So it is a real problem of both the evidence of literature and of archaeology. Literature is not much interested, ancient literature, in the poor. Most of our elite writers see the poor as a blot on the landscape. And the poorer you are in terms of archaeological evidence, the less traces you leave. That if you're living in a house, made of bricks and mortar, something survives of your living accommodation. If you have a tent under the arch of an aqueduct, you leave no trace. So I think we have to reckon that there's a lot of people in the ancient world who leave no trace. What they did in terms of their day-to-day activity, we really also have not much clue. I mean, it's very easy to pick up one of those everyday life books, everyday life in ancient Rome. The Romans got up early and had a small breakfast. They then did, you think that is all fantasy. We really don't know. Actually, we don't really know for the rich how they organized their time. But I imagine that for the poor, what's the reasonable hypothesis? It's that they spend all their time trying to get enough wages on what we now call the gig economy to keep body and soul together. And it's a tough life, and it's uncomfortable, and there is no social safety net. The only safety net you have is if you have a patron who is in a better position than you and will look out for you. So if maybe you've been a slave and have been freed by your master, there's still some obligation on him to look out for you. And I think the important thing is that there was no social safety net at all in ancient Rome. So you relied on people looking out for you. So, for example, someone higher up the food chain. So, for example, if you were a slave, had been a slave, and then had been freed by your master, there was still some obligation on that master to give you some support and assistance. But if you had nobody looking out for you and you were poor, I mean, in the most brutal terms, you were, and I hate to say this, you were a problem that solved itself, because those with no support and no work and no money coming in died, basically.
I have a question, actually. Wasn't it during your Pompeii program, it was Andrew Wallace Hadrill, wasn't it, who discovered the sewers in Pompeii and managed to analyse certain aspects of food that the Romans were eating?
Yeah, one of the things that Andrew did, it was at Herculaneum, not Pompeii, but it's a very similar town, also destroyed by Vesuvius in 79. What he discovered was a kind of cesspit under a block of flats. And basically it was where all the contents of the lavatories of the block of flats above had just gone into a great pit, unmediated by anything. And by analysing what was now actually very sort of fine-grained fertiliser, it went down, it wasn't shitty at all, it was just very kind of nice. We put your pot plants in it. By carefully analysing bags and bags of this stuff, he found what the people living above in a very middle-ranking apartment block were eating, because what they put in their mouths come out their bum and then gone into the cesspit, and it was just what you'd expect. It wasn't kind of those lavish Roman banquets of, stuffed dormice, etc. They were eating chicken and eggs, a lot of sea urchins. There was an alarming number of little fragments of sea urchin spikes, which you think must have been a bit painful going through the digestive tract. Fruit. It was a good basic Mediterranean diet, but minus the tomatoes, of course, because the tomato hadn't been introduced.
Do you know what? I think we should throw Mary off with a question. What do you think, Alex?
I'm out of the loop. I don't understand this question, but go, because I know she wants to answer it. So let's go.
So Patterson asks, what is your favourite mushroom recipe?
There's only one mushroom recipe in ancient Rome that has got any fame at all, and it's the mushroom recipe with which his wife Agrippina poisoned the Emperor Claudius and sent him off to burn the gods.
Okay, so yeah, it's favourite in terms of bumping off someone you don't like, basically.
Favourite, very much in inverted commas.
Okay. Okay, I have a question from Andrew Creed. He said, so he's read your Pompeii book and he wants to know, Mary, is Pompeii going to give up any more secrets?
Yeah, loads. 1/3 of Pompeii is still unexcavated. And basically it's being left that way. And there's a very, very small bit of excavation at the moment, just at the margins of that area, basically to stabilise it. But I think that what archaeologists are very conscious of is that, we've got 2/3 of Pompeii. It's quite hard to look after. It's still got secrets itself to give up, like looking at the cesspits and analysing them at Herculaneum, which really wasn't possible until modern forms of bioarchaeology emerged. But it's probably our responsibility to leave that third for future archaeologists, because not only are there new secrets there, enticing as it would be to know them, but also we have to imagine that in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, there'll be more sophisticated techniques for analysing that stuff. And so that it's our responsibility really to leave it behind for those that come after us. So plenty more secrets. We'll no doubt see a few of them, but happily our descendants will see lots more.
We've actually got a question from someone you know. Luke Daly Groves, he actually interviewed him earlier in the week about the Hitler conspiracy, and he got very excited when he knew that you were coming on our podcast. So we had to choose one question, and we finally chose one, and it is, what is the funniest piece of ancient Roman graffiti you have ever read?
Well, the Romans are quite funny, actually. And that's partly what my book about Roman laughter was all about, to kind of remind people that although we think the Romans are terrible stuffed shirts, actually they were pretty jolly in terms of laughter and humour. And there are great bits of graffiti. I think one that I'm very attached to, really, is a little couple of lines of verse on the walls of Pompeii, which says something like, "Oh wall, I'm amazed that you haven't fallen down yet with all the weight of that rubbish that's been scrawled on you." So graffiti kind of makes the wall connect. There's another one, which is on the wall of what looks as if it was a kind of bed and breakfast in Pompeii. And it says something like, "Oh landlord, I'm terribly sorry I wet the bed, but you didn't provide a chamber pot."
I love that. I did walk around a corner at Pompeii to find a massive erection scrawled on the wall. It was a tiny little figure. Proportionately, the rest of his body is the same size as the boner, which was quite a surprise because I had never seen Roman pornography before either. And
I was being very, very careful in interpreting Luke's desire for funny graffiti, and I was not going to the raunchiest graffiti, but I tell you, if you're interested in all the different versions of "I had a great bit of sex here," rather more crudely than I just put it. Pompeii is the place to go. There's a great Roman word, and I'm sure you can guess, even if you don't know Latin, what it means, which is it's a verb, futuo, and the FU I think will give you. And there's plenty of graffiti which says, I futuoed many girls here.
I love it. Mary has taught, if nothing else, you learn nothing else from this podcast, Mary has taught you how to swear in Latin. I love this next question. Francis Merrick wants to know, he says, you're hosting a dinner party, and then he says perhaps feast is more apt, and can have a time machine at your disposal. Which figures from the classical world are you going to invite?
I think that's dead difficult, because you instantly think, oh yes, I'd like to have the great orator Cicero, find out what he's like, or Nero, he'd be fun, or Agrippina, the murderer of the Emperor Claudius and mother of the Emperor Nero. And I think some of those would be quite nice, but really I think the people that I'd want to hear from at my dinner party would be all the people that we don't sort of hear about or from in the ancient world itself. So I would like to hear about I'd like to invite the guy who kept the local baths. I'd like to invite the slave cleaner. I'd like to invite, I'd like to find, going back to the idea of raunchy graffiti, I'd like to invite not the clients from the brothel at Pompeii. I'd like to hear it from the girls who work there. So I think a fantasy dinner party would be an excuse for not just meeting your favourite big men and women from antiquity, but it'd be a chance to meet the people we don't hear about.
I'd love to. Would you invite Aristotle as well, so you could tell him what you think of him, or grill him?
We could tick him off.
Yes.
I think I might avoid philosophers.
Yeah, I think they'd hog the conversation, wouldn't they?
Cicero, everybody philosophers would certainly hold the conversation. They would be a bit of a pain in the butt. Cicero, everybody would think would be very boring, but we tend to forget that although we see Cicero now as kind of this po-faced orator, standing up in the forum, waving his arms around and dressed in a toga, his reputation in the ancient world was that he was the funniest man who ever lived, and if he had one fault, it was that he just couldn't keep a joke in, even when he was better off not joking. So I think he could be kind of amusing. But again, I suspect he'd go on a bit.
I don't think one of my best friends, Linda, will be very happy with that answer. She really does not like Cicero. I don't know why. One of these days I'm going to find out why, but she can't stand him for some reason. I might ask her. But Mary, listen, I really want to thank you for something really important for me. So you actually saved me from an exam, not once, but twice. So I was doing my practical archaeology exam. For those who are listening, yes, I'm also classified as an archaeologist theoretically. And the night before, I watched your Pompeii programme. And let's just say I passed with flying colours and used a lot of Mary Beard suggests and a lot of Pompeii. And I need to apologise. I'm really sorry, Tim, that I did that. But now you know the truth.
That's quality history programming right there then, isn't it?
That's right. I'll be quoting you, Alina, don't worry.
Mary, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And it's been great to be here, and I'm really pleased that you're doing this, particularly when we're all quarantining ourselves. It's great things to listen to.
I think Alina is trying to plan one of our Down the Pub Friday night debate sessions for classical ancient history. So if you want to join us down the pub in due course, we'd love to have you. Tomorrow...
I don't have to drink a whole bottle of vodka, Alina.
Yeah.
Only if you join me.
A huge incentive to over drinking.
Yeah, it does.
Drinking with Mary Beard, I'll be the luckiest girl alive.
Okay, tomorrow we have, and actually our guest tomorrow is another fantastic historian. Even he was excited about the idea of Mary Beard's Q&A. Dan Jones is with us tomorrow afternoon. Of course, Britain's best medievalist, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of writing epic history from the period. He's written about Plantagenets, the Wars of the Roses, the rise of the Tudors. He talks to us, actually, as well as talking about his books, fascinatingly, he talks about his new project and stuff he's moving on to, but also how to write an epic history like that and comprise a massive subject down into something readable for the general public. So it's a really interesting chat with him. So we will see you tomorrow. Mary, once again, thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye.
And at home, make sure that you stay safe if you can, and because you really should now, stay at home. This is Nighthawk signing off.